Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine for a moment you're walking down a familiar street in your city, and you see law enforcement officers present. Nothing unusual there, right? But something feels profoundly different. They're dressed in civilian clothes, their faces completely obscured by masks. There are no visible badges, no identification tags. Maybe their vehicles are unmarked. How would you feel in that moment? What kind of questions would immediately, flood your mind? Would that presence make you feel safer, or would a sense of unease, perhaps even alarm, start to settle in? Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of information, whether it's your articles, your research, or your personal notes, and we really try to distill the most crucial insights, giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today we're embarking on a fascinating and frankly quite chilling deep dive sparked by an excerpt from a video. It's titled, "Who is that man in the mask?" from the Lincoln Project's The Elephant in the Room series. Our mission today is to thoroughly explore the serious questions raised by this phenomenon. Questions about accountability, the very nature of democracy, and the fundamental role of law enforcement when the identities of those wielding state power are intentionally hidden from public view. We aim to dissect the implications, both historical and contemporary, of such a shift.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, and indeed critical to understand, is how this discussion connects directly to some of the most fundamental principles of governance, individual rights, the things that underpin any society aspiring to be truly democratic. We'll be examining the historical context of secret police forces throughout the world, drawing parallels that are both stark and, well, sobering. We'll also look at specific recent events right here in the U.S. that have brought this issue into sharp focus, forcing us to confront its immediacy. And perhaps most importantly, we'll delve into the profound potential implications for a democratic society when law enforcement, the very individuals entrusted with immense power, including the authority to use force, begin to operate anonymously. This naturally leads us to ask, what are the civic dangers when those who are supposed to protect and serve become unidentifiable to the public they serve? And, what does such a practice signify for the delicate social contract we, as citizens, have with those who wield the power of the state on our behalf?
Okay, so the source material we're exploring, it immediately plunges us into a really stark image, one that evokes a sense of unsettling, almost dystopian reality. It vividly describes masked cops in the street wearing civilian clothes, full face masks, no badges, no IDs, no warrants, unmarked vehicles. And this isn't just presented as some random, isolated occurrence that could be dismissed as an anomaly. No, instead, it's highlighted as a significant, deeply troubling, and potentially systemic shift. A shift in how law enforcement operates in certain situations within our country. The video specifically recounts seeing these unidentifiable officers, their faces completely obscured, operating in Chicago. The speaker notes they were there for fundraising events when they witnessed this presence, describing it as intentionally designed to be anonymous, stripped of the usual indicators that allow for public identification and, by extension, accountability. Which raises immediate questions about transparency and trust, doesn't it? When the very individuals enforcing laws cannot be identified by the populace.
Right. Building on that scene, what's truly chilling and compels us to connect this to the broader historical picture is the direct, sobering parallel the source draws. It unequivocally posits that every single fascist enterprise, every single autocracy, every single dictatorship in the history of the world has depended on some form of the secret police, some form of the unaccountable system of quasi-justice. And mine boy, this perspective suggests that the issue isn't merely about individual officers choosing to wear masks, it's bigger. It's about the system of inherent unaccountability that such anonymity not only facilitates but perhaps even encourages. Historically, if we look across various regimes, these secret police forces have invariably been run by the dear leader, by the loyalists, by the people at the top of the state structure who explicitly consider themselves to be the enforcers of the will of the dictator. Consider some of the most notorious examples that illustrate this pattern. Saddam Hussein's Mukhabarat, which was his dreaded intelligence service known for its brutal repression, or the Nazis' terrifying SS. Hitler's paramilitary organization responsible for systematic terror and implementing horrific policies. And the Russian NKVD, which later evolved into the infamous KGB, both known for pervasive surveillance, political repression, and operating outside traditional legal frameworks. These were forces designed specifically to operate beyond public scrutiny, enforcing the will of a single leader through fear and anonymity. So, for a country like America, which has historically prided itself on not having such a force, on being, a beacon of transparency, due process, and the rule of law, while this development represents a fundamental deviation from those cherished principles, it forces us to ask, are we witnessing a subtle yet profound erosion of the very foundations upon which our democratic system rests?
That historical context really underscores the stakes. Yeah. And here's where the source material gets really provocative, truly grabbing your attention. The speaker in the video makes a bold and, frankly, quite challenging claim. One thing America has never had was a secret police. Until now.
Yeah.
Wow. That is an incredibly powerful statement. It suggests not just a tactical shift, but a fundamental transformation, a dangerous evolution in the American landscape of law enforcement. Now, the source readily acknowledges that there have certainly been abuses of power in different parts of the government over time, and it even specifically points to the FBI's problematic actions during the civil rights movement, for instance. But the fundamental concept of a truly secret police force, a body operating with unchecked anonymity and beyond traditional oversight, is presented as something new and deeply concerning to the U.S. This assertion directly challenges the long-held perception of American law enforcement as inherently transparent and accountable to the public. It raises the stakes significantly for the current situation we're discussing. It compels us to consider if what we're currently observing is not just a pragmatic or temporary tactical choice by some agencies, but rather a deeper, more systemic erosion of democratic norms. Those institutional safeguards that we've historically relied upon, is this merely an isolated incident or maybe a harbinger of something far more pervasive and permanent?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this brings us to a crucial aspect of this debate. The justification often offered for such anonymity. The source directly addresses a common defense, which is the concern that our agents are getting doxxed, meaning their personal information, like home addresses or family details, is being revealed online, potentially endangering them or their families. And look, it's a legitimate concern for any public servant, absolutely. However, the speaker in the video strongly rejects this as a valid excuse for widespread anonymity. They state quite unequivocally and with considerable force that I don't believe that any nation where the police are unaccountable should extend to those police the courtesy of pretending that their identities are some special secret. Overmesh. That's a profound philosophical point, really. It suggests that the trade-off between officer safety and public accountability isn't a balanced one when anonymity is involved. Not at all. The very essence of a democratic police force, it implies, is its explicit and inherent accountability to the public it serves. Period. If agents operate without identifiable marks, it creates a veil, right? A shield that can protect them from scrutiny for their actions, potentially undermining the public's trust. And the normalization of such a practice, where identities are concealed as a default, well, that could lead to a significant, perhaps irreparable erosion of trust between law enforcement and the public. Think about it. If citizens cannot identify those who are arresting them or exercising force, how can they possibly hold them accountable for potential abuses of power? This could inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, foster a cycle of suspicion and fear, fundamentally altering the relationship between the state and its citizens and making true civilian oversight nearly impossible.
Yeah, nearly impossible. And what the source material really hammers home, making it unequivocally clear, is the non-negotiable requirement for law enforcement officers to be identifiable to the public. It states very clearly that police officers should be required, when they're arresting any person, to show a badge and a warrant and their faces. And it's absolutely crucial to understand the universality of this principle. This applies to everyone, including people who are here as immigrants, whatever their status. It doesn't matter. The core components of accountability, as meticulously laid out in the source, are explicitly called out. Badges, warrants, faces, ID tags, identifying marks, and uniforms. These aren't just arbitrary rules or, bureaucratic formalities. They are, according to the source, the bedrock, the foundational elements of a functioning, accountable law enforcement system in a true democracy. The source goes even further, delivering a stark warning. Because a secret police system where there are no badges, no ID tags, no identifying marks, no uniforms is not a democracy that lasts for long. It simply isn't.
Wow.
So this isn't merely a discussion about procedural fairness or minor adjustments to police protocol. It's framed as a direct threat to the very survival of democratic principles when the agents of the state are permitted or encouraged to operate in the shadows. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that anonymity in policing isn't just a slight deviation from norms, but a direct existential threat to the foundations of self-governance and legitimate citizen oversight. It really begs the question, if we cannot identify those who arrest us, how can we truly hold them accountable under the law?
Exactly. And this isn't merely a theoretical debate about what should be done or some philosophical discussion removed from everyday reality. Not at all. The source material points directly to real-world legislative action and the anticipated, almost inevitable political and legal pushback. It highlights that California is passing a bill this week to mandate that IC agents may not wear masks. So that demonstrates the concern is not abstract. It's a tangible issue that is compelling legislative bodies to take concrete steps to try and restore transparency. However, the speaker immediately follows this observation by predicting a significant and contentious clash, stating with a tone of certainty, "I promise you the federal government and Trump will defy that law. It'll go to court." This underscores that the issue is a deeply contested legal and political battleground, not just confined to a few rogue agents or isolated incidents. It suggests a systemic disagreement, right, at the highest levels of government regarding the necessity of accountability versus perceived operational security. This naturally prompts us to consider. If the federal government actively seeks to defy state laws aimed at ensuring law enforcement transparency, what are the long-term implications for the balance of power between federal and state authorities? More critically, what does it mean for the public's ability to impose meaningful checks on authority? If this trend continues, where anonymity becomes a tool fiercely protected by those in power, it sets a dangerous precedent. A precedent that could profoundly reshape civil liberties, the delicate balance of federalism, and the very nature of policing in America for generations to come. It's a battle over who truly holds power and how transparently it must be exercised.
A battle, yeah. And the source employs a particularly powerful and, frankly, chilling analogy to describe the escalating danger inherent in this situation. It says, the ratchet of accountability and abuse, lack of accountability and abuse, runs only one direction. Think about that image for a moment.
Yeah.
A ratchet, right? By its very design, it only tightens. It doesn't loosen on its own. Once a gear clicks into place, it's fixed, and the next click only pulls it tighter. This paints a grim, almost irreversible picture of the gradual yet steady slide towards less accountability and consequently greater potential for abuse. The speaker in the video warns that if the practice of wearing masks becomes normalized for law enforcement, it won't remain an isolated incident or a rare exception. No, instead it could quickly spiral, becoming the norm. The idea would propagate that all cops better start wearing masks all the time, and the off-cited excuse that they could get doxxed would then be universally used to justify anonymity across the board, making it the default mode of operation rather than a temporary exceptional measure. This concept suggests that any erosion of accountability, once accepted and institutionalized, becomes incredibly difficult to reverse, leading to a steady and predictable increase in potential abuses of power. It's a stark warning, isn't it, that what might appear to be a seemingly small, perhaps even justifiable tactical change can have massive, systemic, and ultimately corrosive implications for the future of civil liberties and the very relationship between the state and its citizens. It's a one-way street towards less oversight.
Absolutely a one-way street. And expanding on that powerful ratchet metaphor, what's truly insightful from the source is its emphasis that this isn't just about one specific segment of the population, like immigrants or one type of federal enforcement. The concern about anonymous agents extends universally to all citizens. The source warns, quite explicitly, you are going to see this start to happen with people who are not illegals. We've already seen it starting to happen in California when we have active duty military forces. This highlights a broadening scope of concern, encompassing a wider range of citizens and scenarios. The source specifically mentions different federal agencies like ICE, DHS, ATF as examples where this trend might be observed or is already present, implying a broad spectrum of potential application across various governmental enforcement branches. Now, what's particularly surprising, and where we connect this to the broader political landscape, is that the source points out a potential hypocrisy or a significant shift in traditional political stances. It directly challenges a long-standing, often passionately expressed libertarian-leaning concern frequently articulated by some on the right. The speaker states, Republicans, most of you used to say shit like, if the ATF comes to my house, I'm going to shoot him dead. If you're masked and anonymous and you don't have a uniform on, then there's a possibility Americans are going to say, I don't know who that is. That raises a profoundly important question, doesn't it? Does the issue of anonymous enforcement transcend typical left-right political divides? Does it touch upon fundamental concerns about unchecked government overreach and maybe even the right to self-defense that should alarm anyone, regardless of their political affiliation? It suggests that the perceived threat from an unidentifiable, unaccountable agent of the state might be a shared apprehension that cuts across traditional ideological lines, challenging even those who typically support law enforcement when that enforcement becomes opaque.
It's a fascinating point about crossing ideological lines. And the source truly doesn't pull any punches. It also directs a pointed critique at a very specific mindset that it perceives within some segments of law enforcement. There's a strong and quite vivid description, almost an anecdote, of what it describes as a lot of these guys who have now the idea I'm going to tool up in full body armor. I'm going to treat everything as a SWAT raid. I'm going to treat everything as door kicking in Fallujah, unquote. This paints a compelling, if maybe exaggerated, picture of an overly militarized approach to policing, where every single situation, regardless of its actual threat level, is seen and approached as a high-stakes combat operation requiring maximum force. The source then uses incredibly illustrative and frankly quite humorous examples to highlight the perceived absurdity and indeed the over-militarization of some police tactics. And it links it directly to the inherent lack of accountability when identities are hidden. It sarcastically questions the necessity or even the sanity of applying such aggressive tactics to everyday situations. Like the example of a 60-year-old grandmother who's a housekeeper in a hotel somewhere you're dragging out in the street. It needs a Tier 1 special operations unit to take her down the over-exaggerated, tactical Tommy bullshit. It is just that. And the humor doesn't stop there, with phrases like Meal Team 6 and describing officers as 325 pounds on Juan. They're the gardener. This isn't just a critique of tactics. It's a direct challenge to the perceived disconnect between the disproportionate level of force being deployed and the actual threat posed, particularly when those wielding that force are anonymous and seemingly beyond reproach. It forces us to ask, does this kind of aggressive military-style mindset combined with hidden identities lead to a greater propensity for excessive force, precisely because the individual officer feels less personally accountable for their actions and more like an anonymous soldier in a combat zone? This combination could profoundly impact public safety and erode trust. So given this escalating concern, what can you, the listener, actually do about this? And why does this issue matter so deeply to the very fabric of our society?
Right, that's a critical transition because the source doesn't simply present the problem and leave it hanging there. It moves beyond diagnosis to offer concrete, albeit some might consider them unconventional, actions for citizens to take. It provides very specific advice, almost like a public service announcement. When you see these DHS and ICE people without uniforms on, without name tags, wearing the masks, call 911 immediately in your city or your county. Call 911 because you need to say there are masked men, armed masked men outside of X or Y school. I don't know what they're going to do. I'm afraid I see masked men outside the First Central Bank or wherever it is, the closest bank. Now that's a stark and deliberate instruction. It's essentially treating unidentifiable armed individuals, even if they claim to be law enforcement, as a potential threat requiring immediate local police intervention. It's a provocative reversal of the expected order, wouldn't you say? Beyond this direct action, the source also suggests other responses, including the somewhat playful but symbolic act of throwing glitter on them, which it describes as a chef's kiss idea, may be a form of nonviolent, highly visible protest designed to make anonymity impossible. But most crucially, it urges citizens to document and gather evidence. Record these people, get the numbers on, and get the tag numbers because the cars still have to be registered. Get as much identifying information as you can. This emphasizes a citizen's perceived duty to make sure that people who right now are hiding behind a mask to abuse the power they are given are identified. This raises an important question for all of us. Does this call to action reflect a breakdown in trust so severe that citizens are now being asked to effectively police the police rather than simply relying on existing systems of accountability? It certainly highlights a profound shift in the public's perceived role in maintaining oversight of state power, suggesting a last line of defense in a system where traditional checks and balances are seen as failing.
A last line of defense. Wow. That brings us to the very heart of the matter. What does this all truly mean for the fundamental social contract between citizens and the state? The core of the issue, according to the source, lies in a crucial and often overlooked trade-off inherent in our society. It explains that we give police and law enforcement tremendous power. We let them execute the power of the state, in which case they are allowed to use firearms and violence against you, and they are protected by law. That's a stark acknowledgement of the immense authority and the extensive legal safeguards granted to law enforcement officers in our society. They are given unique powers, including the authority to detain, arrest, and use force, even lethal force, in the name of the state. However, the source then immediately introduces the counterpoint, the other, equally vital side of this implicit agreement, arguing that accountability is a two-way street. The premise here is clear. If law enforcement desires and indeed requires this particular set of legal and civic protections, and if they want to maintain a role in society that is often treated, especially in certain circles, as sacred, then they must, without exception, be fully accountable for their actions. The source then draws a very clear and alarming line, almost a direct causal link, connecting anonymity to abuse. The abuse of that power always starts with the mask. It always starts with hiding their identities. It always starts with turning off the camera. This isn't presented as a mere coincidence or an accidental correlation. It suggests a clear and predictable pattern for how the abuse of power escalates. It implies that the deliberate decision to obscure one's identity is frequently the very first step towards operating without oversight, ultimately leading to a profound loss of public trust and credibility in society. It makes you deeply consider, if the very foundation of trust in our institutions is predicated on transparency, what fundamentally happens to that trust and to the social contract itself when that transparency is deliberately and systematically removed?
And this leads us to the gravest warning presented by the source, one that speaks directly to the highest levels of government. It states quite explicitly that the government at the highest levels is complicit in this. They like the fear, they like causing terror, because the blackout face masks cause terror. Now, that's not just an accusation. It implies a deliberate strategy to instill fear and control through the very act of anonymity, knowing full well that they can never be identified if they abuse somebody. This opens the door to terrifying scenarios, such as someone being beaten in a van with no witnesses or identification, where it becomes, as the source puts it, a dare word against his. He never saw their faces, he never saw their names, they never told him their names, they never produced a warrant. Imagine the sheer powerlessness of an individual in such a situation. No recourse, no means of identifying their abuser, no path to justice, because the system has allowed for complete opacity. What's particularly striking and thought-provoking here is the stark contrast the source draws to the public reaction to mask mandates during the COVID pandemic. It highlights what it perceives as a profound double standard, almost a cognitive dissonance in society's response to different types of masks. The source states, Republicans were so triggered by people wearing masks during CO. Those masks were for people to protect themselves. But you're not afraid of mask cops. You're not triggered by masked police officers. You're not triggered by anonymous secret police. No uniform, no warrant, no name tag, no face, no nothing. This begs an important question for you, the listener, to ponder. Why the seemingly different reactions to different types of masks? Especially when one is for personal health protection and the other is for the deliberate concealment of identity by state actors who wield the power of force, arrest, and even potentially life and death. The ultimate implication presented by this source is chilling and unambiguous. There are going to be people who get killed, and there are going to be people who, when they see the masked man kicking the door down that doesn't identify themselves as a cop, doesn't produce a warrant, doesn't have an ID, doesn't have a uniform, come in my house. You're not coming out. This is insane. It needs to stop now. This is a direct and visceral warning of potential violent escalation and the erosion of fundamental civil liberties. The final overarching message is a profound statement about the very nature of a truly free society. If we have people in our society who can exercise violence, who can exercise the powers of arrest, who can yield life and death, and you don't know who they are, then your country is gone. It posits that the ability to identify those who hold power over life and liberty isn't merely a preference, it's a fundamental, non-negotiable requirement for a functioning democratic society to endure.
Wow. What an incredible deep dive into the very fabric of accountability, trust, and the essence of democracy itself. We've unpacked the alarming trend of masked, unidentifiable law enforcement, meticulously examined its chilling historical parallels to secret police forces like Saddam Hussein's Mukhabarat, the Nazis' SS, and the infamous KGB. We've explored the profound implications for our society when agents of the state are allowed to operate in the shadows outside the traditional bounds of transparency. We've heard about the critical importance of identification, the insidious ratchet effect of escalating abuse, and even heard explicit calls for citizens to act as a crucial check on this potentially unchecked power. This entire discussion, as the source suggests, ultimately boils down to a deeply personal yet profoundly civic question about what kind of society you want to have. It's a challenging thought that asks each of us to consider what we value most in the delicate and often tension-filled relationship between citizens and those entrusted to enforce the law.
It really does, and this raises a truly important question for you, the listener, to carry forward beyond this deep dive. Given everything we've discussed today, the historical context, the arguments for and against anonymity in law enforcement, and the potential civic dangers highlighted by our source, if you personally encountered an anonymous, masked individual claiming to be law enforcement, what would be your very first action? And what does that reaction, that instinctive response, say about the trust you currently place in our institutions and the fundamental principles you hold for your society?
We hope this deep dive resonated with you and provided a shortcut to being well-informed on this critical issue. If it did, please do us a big favor. Like and share this deep dive. Your support truly matters and helps us continue these vital explorations. We appreciate you being part of the deep dive community.